with your host, me, Oprah Winefrey. Today we'll be looking at the book My Antonia by Willa Cather. Willa Cather and Jim Burden were old friends who shared a common memory of a bohemian girl named Antonia. A recollection of her meant an excavation of his childhood memories, the country, its people, and the livelihood. He then wrote a vivid description of his journey growing up and presented it to Willa, and then adapted it into a narrative by Cather. Started off his narration at the age of 10. They often traveled across the country from Virginia to Nebraska on the railroad. Jake Mapool, a hired man by Jim's grandparents, accompanied him on the journey. Jake Mapool was slightly illiterate and had a violent temper, but yet so soft-hearted and jovial. Otto Fuchs, also a hired man, picks them up to go to Jim's grandparents' house. Otto was a wanderer of the western country who came from Austria. He had been almost a prowess at different trades: cowboy, stage driver, bartender, miner. He resembled a desperado and he was always ardent about his work. As Jim entered into his new space, he felt as though it was so void of detail. It was obliterated from reality. Jim's grandparents, Josiah and Emmeline Burden, had their part to play in weaving Jim into the new culture. Mr. Burden was a religious man, strong in his faith, but rather taciturn and laconic. Miss Burden, however, was very compassionate and always expressed concern, especially for the Bohemians. Otto befriends Jim and gave him tutorials on throwing a lasso. He also told him stories and even brought him a pony called Dude. He explores his new environment and feels utter contentment with life at that moment. Feelings of entire happiness were expressed. The Schmurders were the first Bohemian family to migrate to that area. They purchased land from a conniving man named Peter Krajek. Jim was fond of the family at first encounter. Over time, the relationship between the Burdens and the Schmurders wavered. Their family consisted of 5 people though. Mr. Schmurder was a crestfallen man, artistic and scholarly. He experiences nostalgia for his old country where he made good wages and he saved. Jim thought Mrs. Schmurder was loathsome, rudely abrupt, bossy and blunt. They loved to give away sentimental things. In fact, he thought that this gullible trait of theirs is the reason why they were living so desolate. Yelka is a young girl who was always eager to go on adventures with Jim and Antonia. Ambrose was the oldest son. He was labeled brilliant and even the reason for the migration. His personality resembled that of his mother in some ways. Marek was the younger brother. Jim often referred to him as the crazy boy because of his psychological abnormalities. Antonia was 3 years older than Jim. She was the only one that was learning English and her knowledge of it grew as Jim taught her. They went on many adventures together. Peter and Pavel are 2 Russian farmers who lived close to Jim and Antonia. They came to America after a rather unfortunate wedding incident. In order to save themselves, they threw both the bride and the groom to a pack of hungry wolves. Can you imagine that? The ostracism forced them to move out of their native. Pavel died of illness sometime after. Jim was 11 years old by then. He was mature and taking responsibilities early. Then a tragedy occurred. Mr. Schmurder died. By springtime, the Schmurders got a new home. Antonia got a new attitude concerning farm life as well. She was noisily like a man. She worked hard and was proud of her strength. Now, even though Mrs. Schmurder was not well acquainted with the field activities, it was as though Antonia felt she had to pick up responsibility when he died. Perhaps it was her coping strategy. Many times, seasons affected their moods and manipulated events. Summer was joviality, adventure, and absolute contentment. Winter was sickness, death, bitterness, and struggle. Autumn had settlement by immigrants on the prairie of Nebraska. Spring suggested a time of hard work. When Jim was 13 years old, they moved to Black Hawk. His lifestyle was modified to adapt to one of a town folk. The Burdens came in relation with the Harlings. It was when the Harlings' Danish cook left them, Mrs. Burden suggested hiring Antonia. Some of the Harlings went to the country in Nebraska to arrange with the Schmurders, and a few days later, Antonia came back into Jim's life. Lena Lingard came from the country to work as a dressmaker. Eventually, Antonia transitioned from mannish idiosyncrasies to making pretty dresses for herself. The Vanisses opened up a tent that encouraged socializing. The joy of dancing overcame Antonia, and so dancing at the tents became the hired girl's favorite thing to do. The tents brought together the unlikely friendship or relationship between Black Hawk men and the country girls. Jim compared Black Hawk girls and hired girls. The hired girls mentioned were the 4 Danish girls, the 3 Bohemian Marys, Tiny Sutterbell, Lena Lingard, Anna Hansen, and Antonia Shimura. When men started to pay attention to Antonia's dancing, Mr. Halling foresaw that this might not be a good thing. He forbade her to go back to the tents, but she preferred her passion for dancing and flings more than the respect for sage advice. After they taught her to portray nice ways and to be domesticated, Antonia left the Halling's to work for the Cutters. Mr. and Mrs. Cutter was an unpleasant couple. They argued almost perpetually. Wick Cutter was the leading money lender in Black Hawk and a despicable character. In spring, Jim graduated and dedicated his speech to Mr. Shimura, someone he admired dearly. One time the Cutters left to Omaha, and Antonia agreed to let Jim sleep in the house because she was afraid of its insecurity. Mr. Cutter then left his trip earlier than expected to come home. He found Jim on Antonia's bed and scolded him mercilessly. Jim hated Antonia for it, and he was very adamant about people not knowing what happened. Antonia left the home of the Cutters after the incident. Jim was 19 years old when he left Black Hawk to go to school in Lincoln. Gaston Cleric was his mentor that helped him progress in college. He got an unexpected visit from Lena Lingard, who then had her own dressmaking business. She took him out of his serious mood and relieved him of loneliness. They reminisced on old times and went on dates to the theater and occasionally at her apartment. Jim fell in love. She updated him about Antonia, who was then engaged to Larry Donovan, an arrogant and selfish man. Eventually, Jim had to let go Lena to pursue his endeavors. When Jim was 21 years old, he moved from Boston to Black Hawk. He caught up with everyone and how people changed. He saw a picture of Antonia's baby, which quickened him to find out about Antonia. So Jim left Black Hawk to go to Nebraska. He had a talk with Widow Stevens concerning Antonia. Antonia was ditched by Larry, and she was then living in Nebraska with her baby, who was 1 year and 8 months old then. After the story, he reunited with Antonia and they spent some time together. He promised her he would pay her a visit. It wasn't until about 20 years later that he did. And guess who we have with us today in the studio? None other than Jim Burden himself. So Jim, nice to have you on our show. Sum it up with Opry Wine Free. So tell us, how has life after Nebraska?
Well, recently I moved up to New York and I've gotten involved in one of the Great Western Railways. So I've been raising a lot of capitals in states like Wyoming, Montana. I've helped a lot of young men into the business. We've ventured out into oil. I've married a wonderful woman named Genevieve, so we're just happy.
So Jim, tell me something. Your experience, tell me about the social class, because it had a lot of, country people, a lot of immigrants. What do you think?
In terms of like Antonia, we came into the area at the same time, but our living standards, our starting points was so different because of my grandparents. They still had a farm, they had helpers, they had animals they could sell and buy, so they had so much, while the Shimuras were basically living in a cave-like dwelling and they had to depend on a lot of other people for survival. And then once you went into Black Hawk, they were seen as on a different level. When you actually move into the town of Black Hawk, you will see a separation again between the native town girls and the country girls who were mostly foreign from other countries. So for instance, the town girls were representative of the epitome of womanhood. So they were the finer class. They thought that they had it made actually, while the foreign girls who worked out, well, they were just seen as less. So they were portrayed in the like as domestic help. But in the long run, the foreign girls who were sending all of their money back to their family to help their family, you actually saw that the family prospered as a whole. So even though the family prospers as a whole, each individual leaves the situation better off. If you look at certain individuals like Lena and Tiny, they were just scorned and shunned outright. But they both took a chance to say they weren't going to be the normal female of the household. Instead, they went out into the world on their own ventures and they made their own way.
Speaking of Lena Lingard, we have her in the studio today. Lena Lingard, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome her. Jim left Lincoln, and how was that for you, and what was your relationship like?
I mean, it was sad that Jim had to leave, but we had our moments, we had our time. I was never really ready to get married to him or to anybody, as a matter of fact. Mine and Jim's relationship was wonderful.
What was like the issue of gender and sexuality? How was that like?
I was always a little indifferent about my sexuality and about my body, but I never really paid too much attention to it. I was always accustomed to having men's attention.
Okay, and now for the moment we've all been waiting for. Antonia, make some noise. Antonia, what are you doing now? How is it? I believe you have children now.
Yes. Well, these days I'm just at home looking after my children. They are so adorable. My husband and I, we are going good. We are going fine.
So, Antonia, Mrs. Antonia, your father, I know he passed away. May his soul rest in peace. How did that impact your life?
That was a very difficult stage for me in life. I mean, I was so young. My father was also delighted to see me, you know. He would have been down, and for the time he saw me, he just had this smile on his face. When he died, it took a lot from me. It took me by surprise. My tonight, he made these cute little handsome rabbit skins for me to keep us warm throughout the winter. He used to play songs on these little guitars back in Europe.
Everybody wants to know, how exactly did the relationship between you and Jim go? Did you love him? And if you loved him, like what, a brother, like a friend?
Jim and I were just really good friends, you know. When he killed that snake, I looked at him different from that day. I did. And we were always just friends. I miss him now that I hardly get to see him. I speak about him all the time with my children. And he came to visit me at time, and I didn't notice him. My children were the first to notice him from all these stories that I told them of him when we were young, all the adventures we had and the games we played, and how his grandmother taught me to speak English. We were just friends, really good friends.
Risa. 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 Risa.
Mm-hmm.
You'll come, we have to do the vlog.
We gotta do that now.
Yeah, do it like 2 minutes.
Shucks.
I'm going to go.